So we use Rebase to talk to Firebase because it's really easy with sync state. And until 2 days ago, it was really easy to do authentication with Rebase as well. Unfortunately, they took that out in the new version. They basically thought that Rebase should be limited to just handling that syncing of state and stuff, and that you should just use the Firebase API to handle your authentication. So that's what we're going to have to do. We're just going to have to use Firebase's stuff directly. So it's a little complicated, but we can manage. So let's go to base.js, where we put our other Firebase stuff. We're going to keep as much of the basic setup in here as we can. And this is totally already here because I didn't, that's right, because this wasn't in my Git repository. So this is the same as in the morning. So here's what's happening. We were already importing Firebase from Firebase app, database from Firebase database. Now we need to import Firebase auth. You don't need to give it a name. You don't need to say import something from Firebase auth. You just need to import Firebase auth, because what that's going to do is it's going to add the auth package to the Firebase object that's already there. So don't forget that import or things will break. Then we do our app initialize just like we did before. We set up our database. And then we're going to say, let's like just remove some of this for just a moment and talk about it. You get it, but we need to call app.auth. App, remember, is our Firebase app. Now, app.auth wouldn't be there if we hadn't imported this. So we're going to set this variable auth to that. And then we're going to export it. We're already exporting the result of Rebase create class. But that's our default export. Now we have a named export. We haven't done one before. We've imported them, but we've never exported a named export. So this is how you do it. It's easy. Now, if we were to look at the documentation for some of the authentication methods, the ones we're going to use, the ones that use OAuth, require that you give it this provider object. And that provider is something like Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, etc. But there's a special class you have to initialize to represent that. You can't just use like the string GitHub. So here's how we do that. So we're going to make this variable GitHub provider, and that's going to be an instance of firebase.auth.G GitHub auth provider. And we're going to need that from another file too, so we'll export it as well. So we have two named exports. It's kind of a long one. I'll paste this into Slack real quick.
I'm going to remind you to update your example. Your basic example file.
Thank you. Yeah, so that base.example.js is updated to reflect this. So we're exporting auth and GitHub provider from here. So we're going to need those in our sign-in component. So how do we import those? Let's just do auth first. How do I import auth from base? Oops. I cannot just do that. That's going to be the default export. Even though it's named something else, that's going to be that thing that we called base yesterday. So how do we import that named export? What do I need to change on that line? You know? That's right. Like with component, we use curly braces. So if you look back at the way we do component, we import React, no curly braces, so that must be the default export. And then component inside curly braces, so that must be a named export. So that's how we import auth from base into sign in. Now what are we going to do with that? Well, however it works, we know we're going to have to make our button do something, right? So we may as well add a click handler there. On click equals I'm going to make a little method here called authenticate. Now at the moment, I'm not even seeing that button right because we made signed in always return true. Let's make it always return false for right now. So now we have a sign in button. Let's console log something here just so we can see that it worked. Click, there it is, sign in. We haven't completely forgotten how to do event handlers. Good. So now what? If you look at the documentation for Firebase, it has this auth interface. That is the thing that we've exported as auth. Firebase.auth is what we called, right? So now we've imported the result of that. And it has a whole bunch of stuff on it, including a bunch of sign-in methods. Sign in and retrieve data, sign in anonymously, sign in with credentials, blah, blah, blah. Sign in with pop-up is the one that's going to be simplest for our purposes. Authenticates a Firebase client using a pop-up-based OAuth authentication flow. Important thing is OAuth. We know from looking at the Firebase console that that's what it's using to talk to GitHub, right? So this should work. And looking at the signature here, by the way, when it shows the name of a function and its arguments and its return value, that's called a method signature. You know that from other languages maybe, but when I use that word, that's what I mean. So we see up here that it takes a provider as its argument. So what the heck does that mean? Well, here, I see auth provider in the list. Ooh, what was that? GitHub auth provider, Google auth provider, Twitter auth provider. It's GitHub auth provider that I want. The H is lowercase, notice. All right. So new GitHub auth provider. We already did that, didn't we? Back in base, we exported that as GitHub provider. And it was a named export, so inside our curly braces, we just import it. So we're trying to do sign in with pop-up. We have this auth object already. So inside our authenticate method, let's call auth dot sign in. Look, it even knows sign in with pop-up. And that first argument is the provider. GitHub auth provider, or GitHub provider. But thinking forward, it'd be nice to add Twitter login later or something like that. So how about we make the button actually pass that in? So we could add multiple sign-in buttons, one for each of those services. So instead of just pointing the on-click at authenticate, let's make a little arrow function here and have it call authenticate and pass in GitHub provider. So then we'll make authenticate accept a provider as the argument, and whatever that provider is, we're going to pass it along to sign in with pop-up. Make sense? We're just following directions. What happens if we try to do this? I'm going to leave my DevTools open to see if anything explodes. And I'm going to click sign in with GitHub. And it's opening a pop-up. Everybody get something that looks like this? I need to authorize my ThingList application to access my GitHub account. So it's not going to be able to do much. It'll just be able to get my personal user data and my email address. Seems safe enough. However, if I'm going to log into this thing at all, I'm probably going to have to give them my email address. So may as well just use my GitHub account so I don't have to create new credentials. It's okay with me. I'm going to go ahead and authorize it. Now notice this, before I click authorize, authorizing will redirect to that URL there. That's the callback URL that we copied and pasted out of Firebase into our GitHub settings. So sign in with pop-up opens this pop-up and then redirects us to that callback URL. So it sends the information back to Firebase and sends us back to our app. And now we're signed in, not that we can tell. But I didn't get any error messages, so I think it worked. So we have signed in. Sign in via GitHub /Firebase through Firebase.